So I will first invite Mr. Jason Wiseman to brief us on his experience and whatever he thinks his main topic is countering global terrorism and countering terrorism in South Asia. Mr. Wiseman, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to first thank the organizers for their tremendous work in extending me an invitation. It really is an honor to be here. A special thanks to the European Foundation for South Asian Studies, its director Junaid, and invaluable team Dusan and Joanna. Really thank you guys so much. I think it's quite brilliant what you've accomplished here. I also must stress that I'm not here representing any official or EU or MEP position, so should anyone take any issue with my remarks, you have only myself to blame. But I'd like to keep my presentation brief, so I'll divide my remarks into 4 sections. The first will be the approach that member states take to terrorism. The second, the threat environment in and around Europe. Third, the actions taken by the EU and NATO to address this threat. And fourth, which steps remain to be taken. So first, I'd like to stress that if anyone was to ask me if I could sum up everything I know about terrorism into one sentence, the answer would be yes, and it would be as follows. Terrorism is a combination of 2 factors, motivation and operational capability. And what that means in practice is when a certain group of people has the motivation to commit a terrorist attack and they have the operational capability, the tools they need to launch a terrorist attack, then a terrorist attack or a terrorist campaign will occur. It's true everywhere around the world. And if you understand that formula, and then the next question, most relevant next question is, how do you counter it? And it's actually quite simple. It's the exact same formula. To be effective in countering terrorism, you have to counter the motivation and the operational capability of a terrorist organization. One of the 2 is not good enough. It might give you some temporary benefits, but it's not an ultimate solution. But how do you do that? Well, in order to counter operational capability of a terrorist organization, you have to take operative measures. You have to arrest them, you have to kill them, you have to blow up their stockpiles of weaponry, you have to isolate their channels of communication, you have to fragment their financial networks. No matter how effective you are in doing any of those things, you're going to raise their motivation to retaliate. It's the boomerang effect. So it must be remembered that the only way to combat terrorism effectively is to do so preemptively and preventively. You cannot wait for attacks to happen before you start doing anything. Thus, the deterrence factor is essential. However, deterring an organization that sees their mission as something ordained by God, and that not only do they not fear death, but in many cases they glorify it, is extremely challenging. Thus, if and when deterrence breaks down, a rapid emergency response capability must be in place, and when you find yourselves in the need of a rapid emergency response capability, centralization of information and coordination amongst all relevant actors is key. Otherwise, you will have soldiers, Navy, police, medics, firefighters, border guards, politicians, etc., falling over each other in a response to a devastating terrorist attack, and it will in fact only make the matters worse. So second is, what is the threat environment? And when we look at the threat environment, we see how the target is constantly shifting in response to our counterterrorism measures. Now, since the fall of Mosul and the defeat of Daesh, a major concern facing counterterrorism officials is the dispersal of foreign fighters and the potential for new safe havens and war zones to emerge. Now, the concern of returning foreign fighters is magnified when we consider the case of the Paris attacks of 2015. And I'll briefly analyze this because it goes to show how critical some of these gaps in our infrastructure are. 4 of the operatives who staged the Paris attacks entered through Leros, Greece with fake IDs, and 2 of them were already in a database. One of them was on an EU watch list, and another had an open terrorism warrant on their head. 6 of them were wanted on international terror warrants. 1 was under police surveillance with wiretaps and hidden cameras. 7 of them were on a terrorism watch list. 12 of them had even been stopped, questioned, and arrested at some point during their back and forth travels from Syria. And the attacks in Paris were coordinated and directed over the phone from jihadists based in Belgium. The explosives used in the Paris attacks were made in Belgium. Salah Abdel Salam, a Belgian national and the ringleader and the key suspect in the planning of the Paris attacks, successfully evaded authorities for 4 months before being captured. And 4 days after his arrest, a sophisticated terrorist attack was carried out in the Brussels airport and metro station. Now, given that several members of the terror network were already known, having been listed in various databases, stronger coordination, information sharing, and communication among European counterterrorism officials could have prevented both attacks. Thus, European counterterrorism officials had to reorient their strategy and tactics to address this rise in terrorism taking place across the globe. So third are the actions taken by the EU and NATO to address this threat. And I will focus on both separately simply because within the Euro-Atlantic space, these are the two most relevant actors. Recent terrorist attacks in the EU have shown that Daesh is transforming its out-of-area counterinsurgency campaign in Iraq and Syria to a concern of homeland security in Europe and North America. And in response, the two core Euro-Atlantic institutions that have taken the most measures to address this threat. So I want to stay brief in my remarks, but I'll divide these into two categories, short-term and long-term. In the short term, NATO created a new intelligence division, and it has secured communication links to allied capitals, which serves as a key asset for enhancing the exchange of classified information among internal security agencies on a real-time basis. It enhanced the Joint Force Command Center in Naples, its new regional hub for the South, within NATO's command structure, and deployed over 100 additional personnel. NATO and the EU are working to combine political, financial, operational, and logistical assets in prevention, containment, joint training exercises, reintegration, penitentiary system reforms, and deradicalization efforts. And existing joint databases, such as the Schengen Information System and the EU Terrorism Watch List, along with key agencies such as Europol, Club de Bern, Frontex, the Five Eyes Intelligence Community, the EU Satellite Center, the EU Intelligence and Situation Center, are providing essential assistance to national agencies in tracking, monitoring, apprehending, and neutralizing terrorists and their networks. Now, looking to the long term. The primary long-term strategic objective for NATO and the EU is the projection of stability both within and beyond the transatlantic community. Thus, actions taken over the long term aim to accomplish three objectives: stabilizing countries on the periphery, enhancing defensive capabilities, and ensuring viable deterrence. So on stabilizing countries on the periphery, a key added value that NATO and the EU bring is their capabilities and experiences in stabilizing fledgling states through political, financial, operational, and logistical support. And key to these objectives are some core examples that I will briefly cite. First is the EU's military operations in sub-Saharan Africa and off the coast of the Horn of Africa, which are providing ample stabilization capacities for national governments in order to prevent state failure and disrupt criminal and terrorist safe havens from taking root. The EU has also provided considerable political, financial, operational, and logistical support worth billions of euros to the G5 Sahel force as well as the Economic Community of West African States to ensure that local forces have the capacity to take both counter-motivational and counter-operational measures against terrorist networks. NATO has launched an ongoing capacity building initiative, or CBIs, in Jordan, Iraq, and Georgia, along with its crisis management missions in Afghanistan, Kosovo, and the Mediterranean, which serve as an ongoing stabilization force and assist in the transferring of best practices to ensure that nations can defend themselves. And with separate budgets, separate personnel, and a unique set of skills from both aisles, there are a tremendous amount of resources from both the NATO and EU that are providing considerable alleviation of both budgetary concerns on allied countries as well as support via foreign aid and defense expenditures. And finally, the steps that remain to be taken, and I'll list a few that we're working on in Parliament to try and assist member states so that we can cooperate more effectively with each other. So even with the creation of the new EU Counter-Terrorism Center at Europol, which happened in January of 2016, and the approval of the Passenger Name Record Directive, there are a number of actions to be launched at the national and EU level to strengthen Europe's counterterrorism strategies. On the counter-operational side, the EU28 can do a series of following actions. Number one is to mandate that high-value data collected by any national security agency is transmitted within 24 hours of recording to a central system that is permitted to cover non-EU nationals. This is essential. It needs to be reinforced with a shared database in the use of biotechnologies, fingerprints, retinal scans, and so on, so that all EU border and control services and Frontex would have access to it. Formulate joint investigation teams with Europol to transfer best practices to national authorities. Continue to stage regular joint training exercises and simulations with an emphasis on emergency preparedness and civil emergency response that involves all relevant agencies. Set a joint procurement fund with the sole purpose of outfitting, modernizing, and training counterterrorism units. And for the counter-motivational strategy, many things need to be done here. But for example, those that haven't already started should begin doing the following. Create independent civil society advisory boards to local and federal authorities in order to promote internal stability and shared values across society. All member states should continue to set up rehabilitation centers. All member states should create a publicly accessible no-visit list that identifies ideological radicals who pose a threat to the security of a country and who will be prohibited from stepping foot in the EU. Along the same line, a database of those organizations whose charitable status have been removed due to links with terrorism should be publicly accessible as well. EU nations should ensure mandatory screening of citizens involved in public outreach, especially those engaged with quote-unquote at-risk communities. EU nations should set up a specialized team of lawyers and judges with the training specialized team of lawyers trained to prosecute terrorism cases, and judges selected to hear terrorism cases should have the background and training to preside over them. Adopting such recommendations would strengthen the existing counterterrorism cooperation between EU member states and incentivize reform in EU aspiring countries. Most importantly, they would enhance the operational capabilities of the EU agencies, such as Europol and Eurojust, to thwart terrorist recruitment, disrupt terrorist activity, and apprehend the terrorist operatives themselves. Thank you very much.